Hey, welcome back to the channel. This is Joel Duff, and today, an episode of Critiquing Creationism. I'm going to ask the question here: what do young Earth creationists think about climate change? I think you probably know the answer. They're climate skeptics, and they become increasingly vocal about that, especially Answers in Genesis. And we're going to take a look at some recent Answers in Genesis social media posts, along with this book right here, which was just published last year by Ken Ham, climate science expert himself, along with two of his employees. Climate Change for Kids. Yep, we're going there. It's with some trepidation that I take on this topic, but I thought it'd be interesting. I think it's important to talk about how young Earth creationists have sort of changed over the last few years and why they become more and more vocal on this particular topic, why it's becoming a mainstay in their sort of culture wars agenda. So let's get after that. And we're going to do that by starting with just showing you some recent social media posts. I'll talk through some of my thoughts on those, and then we'll come back to this particular book, Climate Change for Kids, which kind of spells out the young Earth creationist position. Well, I should say Ken Ham and Answers in Genesis position. Young Earth creationists aren't a monolithic movement, but nonetheless, what Ken Ham says represents a large fraction of what young Earth creationists would say. So I think just a few of these social media posts will suffice to give you the feeling of what young Earth creationists are trying to communicate to their audience. Only God truly controls the weather. Climate and weather are out of man's control the day before. Simple phrases. Climate. Hey, man can't control that. What could man do to control the weather? God is sovereign over all things, over the entire universe. Without his upholding hand, everything would fall apart. He's in control of history, as we'll see here. God is in control of the sun, the climate, and the future of our planet. If it does happen to get warmer, it's getting warmer because God is in control of that, and God is allowing that. God is, I guess you could say, causing that particular change. Not man. Man doesn't have any responsibility for that. Man, what could man do? Man is such a small, infinitesimal thing. I mean, go to the book of Job, out of the whirlwind. God's basically saying to Job, like, who are you, to be able to explain these things? And who are you to know, like, my thoughts and what I am doing and my purposes? So we shouldn't be concerned or worried or have that much care for or thinking that we, as humans, can control this massive thing called the climate or even our local weather. How dare we think that we could possibly have an effect on something that God is in control of? Now, I'm speaking kind of sarcastically here, right? I mean, that I'm a Christian. I believe that God is, in a sense, God truly does control the weather, right? He's the author of the universe and the elements of it, and is sovereign over those things. And climate and weather are out of man's ultimate control. However, God has also established his world, put man in it, and man has the will to be able to do things which have an effect on this world. If you pave over, tens of square miles of green grass, right, with pavement, you will change the temperature locally of that particular area, right? We do have an effect. Every single organism on the face of the earth has some effect on its local environment, has an effect on its climate. I am breathing out water vapor right now, right? So I'm adding to the humidity around me, and the humidity will change the climate. Now, that's an infinitesimal change compared to other larger scale things. The question then is, do all of us combined, along with our technology and other things that we're doing, does that impact local climate, local weather meaning, on a day-to-day basis, whether it's raining or sunny or, the general temperatures in the area, versus climate, the whole Earth's like energy balance, year to year. Do human beings have a large enough impact on that to be able to say that man is influencing climate, and weather. It's another question to ask whether man is intentionally doing that and purposely trying to control the weather. But does he have some responsibility for the changes in this world, or could man, right, in their knowledge of what effects they might have, could they decide to try to ameliorate those effects? I mean, that's one of the central questions of what to do about climate change, right? There's two different things here that are going on. There's the observation that the world is getting warmer that most people won't deny, and actually Ken Ham even doesn't deny, as we're going to see. Ken Ham doesn't deny that the climate is changing, right? The skepticism is that man can do anything about it, or that man is responsible for it. I mean, even if man is responsible for it, he might even think that we can't actually do anything about it. But I think that many young earth creationists, Ken Ham and his followers, believe that man really isn't enough of a force on this earth to have affected the climate in a significant way. And besides, God wouldn't allow that. Well, we'll see that in just a moment. So how should we think about the climate? Answers in Genesis here. We should look at the climate change from a biblical perspective. So what's a biblical perspective? It involves trying to interpret from the biblical record of history what climate change has occurred. There has undoubtedly been massive climate change, according to the literalistic reading of Ken Ham of scriptures. I mean, there was a global flood. Right? That radically changed the entire Earth's topography and required rain occurring for 40 days and 40 nights and vast volumes of water landing out. I mean, that's a giant climate change. They proposed that there was an ice age after that, in which where I am living right now was under an ice sheet, right? Conventional geologists, climatologists would say that ice sheet was some 20,000 years ago. Ken Ham would say it was only 4,000 years ago. So there's a discrepancy there, but nonetheless, massive climate change. Massive climate change over a period of just tens of thousands of years. We don't even have to think about millions and billions of years. We just think of tens of thousands of years and we've witnessed climate change. Then you get a few other different nuances in terms of the responses, or I would say the resistance to talking about climate change, or admitting that climate change is something that is has a profound effect on this world, and that maybe we should be thinking about how to ameliorate that climate change. And so you get stuff like this, right? Radical climate policies cause real suffering, especially for the poor. And I think behind this is the idea that hey, if we're spending to reduce carbon dioxide levels that are emitted from coal power plants and so forth, and all those mitigation efforts cost money, right? Additional regulation, right? More regulations mean more cost for companies. More cost means higher cost for consumers. And who does that hurt the most? This is, I think, the really simplistic thinking behind something like this. That who does that hurt more? Who does that hurt the most? Well, it hurts the poor. Goods cost more, therefore we're hurting the poor by trying to change the climate when really we can't change the climate. God's in control of it anyway. If it's going to get warm, it's going to get warm. If it's going to get cold, it's going to get cold. There's nothing we can really truly do about it. And so therefore, anything that we try to do that causes disruption in what we would have done otherwise, he views as, hey, that's difficult for the poor. Now, of course, what he needs to do is weigh into that calculation. If the globe continues to increase in overall energy input versus output, all right? So greater amounts of energy. Eventually, there's more ice meltage, the oceans rise. The oceans clearly are rising. And that's an for Ken Ham, the way he thinks about it, right? That's observation. That's real life observation. Sea levels are increasing. Temperatures are increasing. They have been increasing now for quite a while. And that eventually is going to impact many coastal communities. Well, it already is impacting coastal communities. It will impact coastal communities even more if it continues. And that will impact the poor the most. So climate policies that try to mitigate that aren't always just hurting the poor. They are also attempting to protect the poor. Again, this is just typical stuff from Answers in Genesis here. But climate change alarmism is as much a worldview-based hysteria. It's all just hysteria. I admit there's hysteria. There's hysteria in all topics. But that's the thing. Ken Ham and younger creationists feed off the hysteria. They feed off those who talk about, all of humanity being wiped out by the year 2100. Right? Like we'll all be gone. And that's an extreme view. Right? That really is an extreme view. Often those extreme views are just like the extreme views of Answers in Genesis. Genesis is a hysteria producer themselves. Right? They specialize in hysteria. It's the hysteria over all kinds of cultural things. And part of that is a strategy, that hysteria. All right. Everything is the most important thing. If you read if you read Ken Ham's latest tweet, this is the most important thing affecting us. And yeah, some of those things are important, but not everything can be the most important. Not everything can be the end all and be all and worst thing ever. Now, I think that I think some stuff is overblown. I don't think that there aren't going to be any people on Earth in the year 2100. However, this is the way Ken Ham markets it, as if that's what all climate change advocates believe, is that somehow the world is absolutely doomed to utter destruction. Of course, they're playing up the worst case scenario in order to try to get people to act. Just like Ken Ham plays up the worst case scenario for virtually everything in the culture wars to suggest that everybody is going to succumb to this, that, and everything else that he thinks is needs to be changed. But put that aside, the hysterical type of stuff. And what happens is Ken Ham is, and maybe this particular quote better illustrates it here. Climate change activists have the wrong starting point. They're starting with man's word, man's desire, man's belief that he can control things, that he's in control of this world. And of course, the wrong history, because the world isn't millions of years old. It hasn't gone through climate changes over millions of years. It's only been around for 6,000 years, according to young Earth creationists. And so, of course, they come to the wrong conclusions. And this is the simplest summation of their resistance to climate change, because it is based on long-term studies over tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of years and even millions of years, looking at patterns and looking at carbon dioxide levels and all these other things to suggest that climates have changed in the past quite dramatically, both much higher than it is, much warmer than it is today, and also much colder than it has been today. And since none of that can really be true in the young Earth creationist timeline, there's then all this stuff about changing the climate is nonsense. Then what are we to believe? We can't believe all this stuff. It's all based on fakery. And this quote, it drives me crazy. I see this all the time, quoted as if it's like a get out of jail free card in any discussion about climate change. It's kind of like throw out this verse and it's like an instant win. I won the argument with this verse. Genesis 8:22. This first part, not in the Bible. This is Ken Ham talking. We don't need to wail and bemoan the future. We really don't need to worry about the future. That's not our concern. The only true creator has promised what? From Genesis 8:22, while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. And this is the polar opposite of the dichotomous view that Ken Ham likes to present. And that is, if you believe the secular world, everything's going to hell in the handbasket in terms of the climate, and there in 100 years, we won't even exist. We're going to destroy ourselves. Right? But what does the Bible say? The Bible says that cannot possibly happen because it's promised after the flood. There's this promise here. The earth is going to remain. There's going to be seed time and harvest. There's going to be cold and heat. There's going to be summer and winter. There's going to be day and night. Those things will not cease. Well, I'm pretty sure we're going to come around to 2100. And whatever the scenario is in terms of, even if the world gets, worst case scenario, like 3 degrees Celsius warmer, that's an enormous amount of energy added to the Earth's atmosphere and its water. All right. And that would have enormous effects on the overall climate, such that, if Kansas is basically uninhabitable, it becomes a desert and we can't grow food there. That means what? There's no harvest there. But I can tell you what, there's still going to be cold. There's still going to be heat. It's still going to be colder in the winter and warmer in the summer, even if it's never really, even if it never gets to be that cold or below freezing. But there'll still be a summer and a winter. There was in the Levant region, where Noah is, where there's barely any winter anyway. That their winter is really dry season and wet season, a little bit cooler and a whole lot hotter in the summer. There's still going to be day and night. Right? Those things aren't going to cease. And guess what? Even if you can't grow food in Kansas, they'll be growing plenty of food in Canada at that time. Where food is growing will change. And that's the thing about climate change. It's not that the world will become completely uninhabitable. It's just that if you move around, especially if you move it very quickly, if you change where you can grow things very rapidly over a 50-year span, it's hard to adapt to that. And you're also forcing lots of people to move, right? Lots of people are going to be living in places that are like underwater because the sea has risen by, 50 feet. And that's going to displace hundreds of millions of people because lots of people live near the sea, especially a lot of people that are in poverty, right? So all of those things are the disruptions, but none of that would negate this verse. None of that would say that God lied here. Because there's going to be seed time and harvest. There's going to be cold and heat. There's going to be some. There just might not be as much harvest, all right? And there might not be as much seed time. God does not promise in this verse, right, that things won't, that where the harvest occurs and where the seed time occurs, where the extreme cold is and where the extreme heat is, all right, where summer and winter are, or how long summer and winter are, would not change. It's simply that those things will exist in the future. So again, this is kind of, I see this as like this verse is often brought out as kind of like the trump card in young earth creationist argumentation, right? It's sort of like, oh yeah, I'm going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. All right, I'm just going to bring out Genesis 8:22. See, God said nothing would change. This verse doesn't guarantee that at all. So we're getting a little bit closer to looking at what is the vision that Ken Ham has for the future, and what does he think about the change that's occurring to the climate right now? Because I'm going to say again, he's not really denying that the climate's changing. He's just saying we shouldn't worry about it. It's not under our control. And besides, the world's not going to be around that much longer anyway. And there's another step and we already know what it is. So we shouldn't be like trying to save ourselves from what's already going to happen. But I'm slightly ahead of myself. Here's a little cartoon from Answers in Genesis. This goes all the way back to 2012, but this sort of starts to show the beginning of their more outward approach to talking about climate and talking about weather, which I would say most of the younger creationists organizations were a little bit reticent to really wade into this area very much. Answers to Genesis is the one that has completely plowed into it now, whereas the other organizations are not as apt to talk about climate change as much. What's the real inconvenient truth? Controversial question of the day. Did human action bring about climate change we see today? And of course, the focus is on the human climate change. That's the place that Ken Ham gets really upset about climate change activists. And then he shows, like, here we're saying, like, hey, there's two people arguing. All right. Oh, it's man's fault. No, it's not man's fault. Right. That seems to be like the two extreme positions. Right. Man has nothing to do with it. It's all man's fault. It's somewhere in between. Man certainly has an effect, right? And the question really is, and that's a question that deserves a lot of discussion, how much is man's responsibility for the changes that we have that go on around us? But back to this particular cartoon, the even more controversial answer, yes. Yes, it's man's fault. Yes, it's not man's fault. But he doesn't mean in this case that they're sort of like, yes, man is somewhat responsible for climate change and that we can do something about it. No, it's like ultimate causes. That's what Ken Ham's aiming at in this particular, well, I shouldn't say Ken Ham specifically, but his organization that pushed this particular cartoon out. Then to Adam he said, because you have heeded the voice of your wife and have eaten the tree of which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground for your sake. So this is, in a nutshell, this is one of those central verses for young earth creationism that is foundational for their beliefs. When sin entered into the world and Adam disobeyed the command of God, the punishment is the curse on the ground. And the curse on the ground is physically changing the world such that it is damaged due to Adam's disobedience of a law. It has physically changed the world. And as a result, the world suffers from that. And part of that suffering may be that we have, well, certainly for Ken Ham's view, is that we have affected the weather, the climate of the world. There are polar ice caps. There are deserts that do not have seed time and harvest, okay? At least where we can plant and harvest. There are animals that are harvesting. But, and so in that case, saying like the whole world isn't like a perfect place where we can harvest and have seed time everywhere and have a climate that is not extreme everywhere. And so that's all caused by man. So yes, the answer is yes, man is at fault. The reason why it's too hot outside and I'm suffering as a result of that, or it's too cold, or it's, there's a volcano, or, all these different things, that's all man's fault ultimately. But yet he still wants to hold out that climate change in the ultimate sense is man's fault because we started the process of destroying the world. And yet he wants to say we're not really responsible for the recent increase in heat due to natural causes, natural being us adding carbon dioxide and doing things like that. Still wants to say we don't have that much of effect. And besides, God is still in control. And he would never allow, again, going back to the verse, let's go back here. God can't allow for the earth to become a wasteland because he's promised that we'll have seed time and harvest and cold and heat. You see how pivotal that is? The ultimate cause really is man. But at the same time, man is still not able to completely destroy this world. And that's why I think Ken Ham is creating this sort of dichotomous view in which he's trying to say that all climate activists believe that man is going to utterly destroy the earth. I mean, they do use that language. They use hyperbole for sure, just like the Bible uses hyperbole, right, to describe the flood and other things. But they're certainly using hyperbolic language to rouse people to action. But I don't think many of them, I'm sure there are a few, there always will be, who would believe that we would completely destroy ourselves. The concern is that we are going to change the earth in a fairly radical way over a short period of time. And that disruption will cause a lot of suffering, a whole lot more suffering to the poor of this world than simply the regulations to try to mitigate climate change. Okay, we're almost there. We're almost to the book. I got it, and we'll be able to wrap this up pretty quick at that point. So way back here in 2014, this is the first big article I remember from Answers in Genesis. Should we be concerned about climate change? And just the fact that they ask that as a question means you know what the answer is. The answer is no, right? It's like, we shouldn't be concerned about it. Oh yes, ultimately you're responsible for the world being destroyed by a flood and the last ice age and the fact that the climate is not perfect anymore. Yes, human beings totally responsible for that. But you really shouldn't be concerned about this recent climate change. That's just what's going to happen. I mean, that's just the residual effect of the flood and of the last ice age, and we're recovering from that. That's all natural in the sense of, like, as a result of our impacts and causing the flood, this is the consequences that we are suffering from. But we're not so important. We're not so we're not so impactful on the environment directly ourselves through our actions today that we can change the climate, or we can't hope to actually reverse that change. It is what it is. So don't worry about it. Right? That's essentially the bottom line, is like, you don't really have to worry. It's not your fault. And if it is changing, then it's changing and God's in control of that. And it was his plan all along anyway. All right, let's get to it. Let's take a look at just a few screenshots from this book. I don't actually have the book. I am really not willing to spend the money to buy this book. And their screenshots on their site telling the book pretty much tell the whole story. It's like, I'm not sure there's a whole lot more in here that I would need to know. So climate change for kids. And you see this directed at the kids, right? You got to get the next generation to understand climate so that they're not duped when they go to school and hear about this other evidence, this other observational evidence that the world is warming. And if they do find out that the world is warming, here's how they should respond to that. So again, we've got Ken Ham, Jessica DeFord, and Avery Foley, none of which are at all have like expertise in climatology, meteorology or anything like that. But we got to tell you what to know about climate change for kids and parents too. And so here's a nice little summation of what you should think about climate change in this case, from a biblical worldview, right? Delve into the science of climate change and discover how science, and here's the important clause here, removed from assumption and speculation. Take the speculation out of science. Take these assumptions. The assumptions, of course, are millions of years, and the studies that look at long-term climate change patterns. Remove those because we know that that's all bogus stuff. And all of a sudden, if you reflect on the history and truth found in God's word, you'll understand true climate change. You'll know what the future is. And therefore, you'll be able to rest at ease knowing what that is. See, climate change is the result of the world's adjusting to the global flood's impact and the ice age it caused. Catch that? What is climate change? This is an admission that climate change is happening. The climate is changing. It's not the same yesterday as it is today. And in fact, there is a trend, and I'm quite certain. I don't have this book, but I've read other articles at Answers in Genesis, and they are to the point where, like, yeah, there is definitely a trend line, right? The globe is warming. However, what that really is, what that change really is it's the world adjusting to the global flood's impact and then the ice age that it caused. Right? There was this global flood, and it was quite warm during the global flood, caused evaporation of lots of water, which then fell quickly in the form of snow. And then there was kind of like a snowball earthy type of thing. It didn't cover the whole earth, but much more ice than we have today. Caused the ice age, which was cooler temperatures around the world. And then ever since the ice age, things have been warming up. So this would be their explanation for the world getting warmer right now. is that it was colder in the past, and it's just, it's recovering. Things are still melting off, right? The world is still warming up from that cold event. Now, what's lost here, of course, is the world hasn't been like on a trajectory of constant warming. It warmed up a lot right after the Ice Age, and then it's been relatively even. And then there's actually been some mini ice ages. They're not really ice ages, all just cooler periods, and not even necessarily global, like the Northern Hemisphere. In the Middle Ages at one period experienced a cooler than average. Of course, just saying the word average means that for some extended period of time, there's been a typical range in order for us to have an average, right? That hasn't changed much. And then over the last 30 years, right, we've experienced a significant increase in temperature. I'm not sure how the biblical model explains that change. Right. But the way they present it to their audience is kind of like, oh, look, there was an ice age. And you know when that ice age happened? Just 4,000 years ago. Right? The flood was 4,350 years ago. So the ice age was only 4,000 years ago. Of course, if you had a mile thick of ice, very close to where I am right now, and it's not here anymore, it must have taken a while to melt. And the amount of energy contained in that had to be, that constantly was absorbing energy from the sun and so forth. And now that some of that ice is gone, well, then things are continuing to warm up. So everything is warming up. By the way, ice levels in glaciers and the North Pole and other areas has been relatively, yes, after the Ice Age, lots of melting, stabilized, and has been stable for several thousand years. And so it's only, again, recently that we've had massive ice losses. So back to this quote here from this book. Echoes of these events are seen today. That's all this is. All that we're experiencing today is just echoes from the past. And that might, who knows how long that will continue. It might keep warming, keep on going for another 50 years, and it might get it several degrees warmer. And that might have real impacts. But that wouldn't be our fault. I mean, ultimately it's our fault, right? Because of sin, which caused the flood, which then caused the ice age. So it is man's fault that there was an ice age. That should have never have happened. But the original, but the warming that's happening today, that's not us, like in industry. That's not carbon dioxide. That's not things that we have done, like ourselves, us, like as if we could just change what we're doing and then cause that to change. That's just baked in. It's baked in. What's going to happen is going to happen because we're still recovering. We're in the recovery. We're in the echoes of these events. So in this book, what you do is you get to learn about the events recorded in the Bible. You get to learn about the real climate change and the real climate change to come. So let's see what that is. All right. So here's the essential diagram. You've got the original world. Let's blow that up a little bit here. You see, there's going to be 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I had to count that again. 7 stages. All right. Loves the sevens. Ken Ham Answers in Genesis and the Creation Museum have lots of sevens. The 7 C's, the 7 this, the 7 that. All right. I mean, the Bible, 7 is a significant number. So we have 7 climatic ages, the biblical climate ages. And what are those 7 ages? Let's take a little closer look at this. Not very clear here, but I think clear enough. You have the perfect age. Now, of course, what the perfect age would be the original creation, the Garden of Eden and the land around Eden and presumably the whole earth, a perfect paradise. Now, I would almost like to get the book to see how they describe what perfect is. Many times that's described as like, there wouldn't have been polar ice caps. There wouldn't have been deserts that don't have any productivity at all. So just like an ambient climate across the whole earth. There's actually disputes as to whether there was rain or not. Just a mist that rises from the ground and sort of waters the land. All right. So everything is very, somehow perfect. Now we've talked about this in other videos, like how do you have ecology and how do you have organisms that are living and um, eating and changing their world around them depending on how much they eat versus their neighbors and how much that, I mean, what about water erosion? And all those things are big question marks for young earth questions in terms of like, what did this original world look like that was perfect, not marred by sin in the way that they think that sin has had a physical, literal physical effect on like the actual mechanisms by which um, molecules function. All right. All right. So you have the perfect world. That's the original climate. That's the climate that should have been, that we should all be experiencing right now, had Adam not sinned. Then you have the groaning climate. So this is right after Adam's sin, and then the world is damaged. And this again is very unclear because, of course, there's not a lot of evidence in the Bible about exactly what that would have looked like. But yes, you have deserts, and you have death of animals, and you have you have natural disasters happening that wouldn't have happened before, and all this stuff, right? So, I mean, you could have had hurricanes, and you could have tornadoes, you could have those types of things, right? Those are things that aren't part of the perfect creation. So that's the groaning climate age. And then we get to the flooding climate age, which is a year of a massive flood that covers the entire earth, right? That's obviously a very different climate. So, yes, young earth creationists, I always say young earth creationists believe in the most extreme climate change. There is no climate skeptic that believes in the amount of climate change that young earth creationists believe in. Okay, it's not even close. They're the ultimate climate alarmists. The flood, massive climate change. Then you had the ice age, and this is really out of necessity, all right? Because there's too much evidence that there was an ice age at some point in the Earth's history. And since it's at sort of the top layers of the geological column, it must have happened after the flood. And therefore, the world obviously was colder. That's just so obvious in the physical evidence that young earth creationists have to incorporate that into their model. And so, and they'll point to like Job and a few other passages of the Bible that makes it sound like maybe there was a little bit colder, although that is some weak evidence there. Nonetheless, biblical ice age lasts 300, 400, 500 years in terms of the buildup of ice. Of course, the ice would have to build up at an enormous rate to cover vast fields of the North and South poles, running all the way down into, Ohio right here, being covered, the top part of Ohio being covered with ice. All right. And then all that ice has to melt off. And so there has to be some mechanism by which the earth warms really quickly. And here again, what is Answers in Genesis and Ken Ham going to say? Like, oh, well, were man responsible for that? You went from an ice age to a temperate climate in the space of 400 or 500 years. That's massive change over a short period of time. And you can't say that man did that, right? I mean, they weren't making that much carbon dioxide then, right? They didn't have cars. They weren't burning fossil fuels, right? They weren't paving over, places and creating more heat sinks and all that stuff, right? They didn't have that many cows that were burping out, various methane, right? So all the things that today people are implicating as things that contribute to increased temperature rises, Ken Ham could come back and say, yeah, but the ice age ended and the world warmed up really fast then, and that wasn't man's doing. And you see how attractive, I think you can imagine how attractive that would be to a follower of Ken Ham and to young earth creationists, and to, honestly, to a lot of politicians today, right? They might not use this particular argument, but I think they're influenced by this kind of stuff. All right, so there's this ice age, the ice age breaks, and then what are we living in today? We're living in the shifting climate age. So that's the new name for it now, the shifting climate age. And it could shift colder or it could shift warmer. It's a rebound effect. It was cold we're rebounding. Some areas are getting a lot warmer. Some areas are shifting in different ways. That's changing. That could change the patterns of the ocean's flow, which then might actually cause some parts of the world to become a little cooler and others to be a little bit warmer over time. And this is all just like we're out of balance. Like the ice age and the flood were like such dramatic events that the washing machine of the earth is still out of balance, and we're still trying to figure out how to like sort everything out. And eventually it might sort itself out more, and the temperatures will reach some sort of like more defined range. And we just happen to be maybe in like a blip where we're like in a big bump right now. With this rise in temperature, but we can't predict that it will keep going up, because you know how people predict that kind of stuff? They use evolution and millions of years in order to make those predictions. And since that isn't true, we don't have any way of predicting what the future will be. Except that young earth creationists believe that they can predict the future because they know the future from 2 Peter 3. That the earth would be burnt up in fire. That all the elements will be burned up in fire, that the whole universe will be burnt up in fire. It kind of depends on who you talk to, the eschatological interpretation. I don't happen to agree with that particular interpretation of those texts. Again, phenomenologically talking about, they're not talking about the physical earth and its future in those verses. But for Ken Ham, who's reading Genesis in a similar fashion, he is applying a somewhat consistent hermeneutic through the entire scriptures. And so when you get to Paul talking about things in Revelation and other areas, in John, I guess, for Revelation, then the world is going to be burnt up in fire. So interestingly, yes, I mean, maybe he should suggest that the world is getting warmer right now, and it's not going to get any cooler anytime soon, because it's just going to keep getting hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter. And this is we're progressing toward when it'll eventually go up into complete flames. Right, the sun might expand, and more than because what do we know about the sun's history? It's only been around for 4,000 years. I mean, maybe it'll suddenly expand and we'll all get burnt up. So, basically saying we don't know the future, right? Except we do in this ultimate sense. We know it's going to be burnt up in fire. So there's your 7 age. I'm sorry, those are your 6 ages, because the 7th age would be heaven. All right. The restoration of the new heavens and the new earth, which in a way is going back to the original perfect creation, but different. We don't need to focus on that. All right. So there it is. This would be like, I'm trying to get you to understand, these are the assumptions. These are the real reasons, the real thinking behind the climate skepticism that Answers in Genesis and most young earth creationists have. Most literalistic interpretations of scriptures lead to this kind of approach to understanding climate change. Yeah. There's a whole lot more going on, a whole lot more that could be said, but I think that is the central thing that I wanted to say. Maybe drop me a line in the comments about whether what am I missing about young earth creationists that might be another core assumption or principle or something that they're applying that kind of feeds their thinking. Yeah. Okay. That's it. That's my my thing about young earth creationism and climate change. Thanks for hanging with me. I'll be back with more controversial topics later. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.